This is Counterpoint, and I'm your host, Tanya Granic Allen. A crisis unfolding half a world away is now hitting home, driving up prices, rattling markets, and exposing just how fragile global energy security really is. The conflict in the Middle East has triggered what experts are calling one of the largest supply disruptions in modern history, cutting millions of barrels per day from global oil flows and choking off critical routes like the Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly a fifth of the world's oil normally passes. In fact, global supply has already dropped sharply, with oil and gas flows down double digits, and the effects are being felt nearly in every country on Earth. So, what and who is most exposed? How long could this last? And are we looking at a temporary shock or a structural shift in the global energy system? As traditional suppliers falter, the world is scrambling for alternatives. Countries across Europe and Asia are urgently seeking new, stable sources of energy, turning to allies like Canada. But at the same time, attention is also shifting to places like Venezuela, a country sitting on the largest proven oil reserves in the world. On paper, it could help fill the gap. In reality, years of underinvestment, crumbling infrastructure, and political instability mean Venezuela is producing only a fraction of its potential, and experts say it could take years, even a decade, to meaningfully increase output. In other words, the cavalry isn't coming anytime soon. So, what does that leave for Canada? What are our allies asking of us explicitly, and how urgent are those requests? What have we been able to deliver so far, and what more could we do? And perhaps most importantly, if infrastructure constraints here at home are limiting our ability to respond, what is the real path forward to scaling up Canadian energy for a world in crisis? Well, joining me now to unpack it all is Shannon Joseph, Chair of Energy for a Secure Future. Thank you so much, Shannon, for joining me today. I appreciate your time, and I know you're an expert in this, so I look forward to really unpacking it all.
Thank you for having me.
Excellent. So let's start with the big picture. How significant is the crisis in the Middle East right now in terms of global supply, and how much energy is actually being disrupted right now?
Well, how significant is the crisis? Oil and gas represent 80% of all the energy, all the primary energy used on planet Earth for agriculture, for steel production, for cement making, the underpinnings of our economy. So when oil and gas gets disrupted, it's significant. The Strait of Hormuz is a place where 20% of the world's oil and 20% of the world's gas flows, mostly to Asian markets. And so a disruption there is a disruption of almost 30 million barrels a day of oil. And that is 5 times what Canada produces. So it's very significant. And it's extra significant because if you have to replace those energy flows, there aren't many countries in the world who can do it. Canada has a lot of energy. Venezuela, you mentioned, has energy, but is way down in terms of its production capacity. The United States has energy. Russia has energy, which before this conflict, the world was trying to get away from. So we're in a tough spot, but the tough spot has unveiled again kind of the energy fundamentals of the world.
So a lot of us are filling up our gas tanks and feeling the extra pinch now at the pump. In terms of energy, though, globally, which countries are really feeling the impact more acutely because of the Middle East crisis? And why would those particular regions be more vulnerable?
Sure. So I'd say everyone in the world is going to feel the fact that the global energy price has gone up. So last week, a barrel of oil had gone up significantly to over $100 a barrel. When the ceasefire was declared, the futures price dropped off, but we're back at it now with the new announcements of blockades of flows. So that's going to affect everybody. But Asia, which is one of the most energy-hungry regions of the world, it has a lot of emerging economies like Vietnam and like Thailand, others that want to really grow their energy supply so that they can grow their economies. They're kind of one-to-one connected. Countries like Japan, Taiwan, Korea, these are wealthy countries, but they don't actually have a lot of energy. domestically, they're probably some of the least energy self-sufficient countries in the world. 10%, 13%,
Right.
20% energy self-sufficient. That
Okay,
means
I'm gonna pause you there.
80% is coming from other countries.
Okay, I'm gonna pause you there. We've got to go to commercial break. We'll be right back. Welcome back. We're talking about energy disruption globally, especially when we look at conflicts now in the Middle East with Iran and the Strait of Hormuz, and of course, what we experienced earlier in January with Venezuela. And joining me to have this discussion is Shannon Joseph, Chair of Energy for a Secure Future. Shannon, thanks again for joining me. So you were explicating just before the commercial break that some countries have an 80% of their energy dependence comes from what goes through, say, the Strait of Hormuz, and they're being disrupted quite significantly now. So, if you were to advise these countries, or if we're talking to folks from these countries, do we say this is a short-term shock, that this is just going to be a short-term thing, or are we looking at more that we're going to have to do more long-term structural changes so that countries, again, who depend 80% of their energy on this supply won't be long-term impacted?
So before this conflict, countries were looking for long-term structural changes because many of them had been buying oil and gas from Russia, who has been in a conflict with Ukraine since 2022. And so they were looking for resilience from conflict. And now that the Middle East is impacted by conflict, this has created more urgency. And a lot of countries are looking to Canada. I've heard from companies that they are fielding dozens of calls from countries around the world, including a number in Asia, which has been the most impacted. Can Canada help us? And I hope Canadians need to know that this is happening.
Yes, that's an interesting way to say it. So, again, thank you for explaining that countries, I had assumed that countries were actively reaching out to Canada. Are you allowed to say, or do you have information to share as to, you said mostly Asian countries, any other countries in the world, like for example in Europe, are they asking?
Uh, Europe is asking, when Russia invaded Ukraine and they were looking for other supplies, famously the German chancellor came to Canada and Canada said, oh, we'll help you with something else. We're not going to help you with natural gas. A lot of them made contracts with Qatar, which, a week or so ago had some of its facilities damaged in a way that could take about 3 to 5 years to repair. And they can't start repairing it until the war really ends.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yes, Europe is impacted. I've done interviews with India, with the Philippines, and others. I've heard from them. They're reaching out. So I don't know all the countries who are calling, but I can guess what many of them are because
Right.
they're the same countries I've been talking to about how do we get Canadian energy before this conflict started.
Right. And so when we think about the Ukraine Russia, because you're right, this was a hot topic 4 years ago. It's been over 4 years since that conflict started. People really wanted to step away from Russian oil. Now they might be going back to it because, like, well, we don't want Iranian oil, or obviously we can't even access it. It's almost like which is the lesser of two evils. Those requests, though, in 2022, in January or February when that invasion started, were urgent then. It's been 4 years. How urgent are the requests now, and will Canada respond?
So it's still urgent because energy demand keeps going up, and one of the biggest drivers of this is AI, which is a very energy hungry technology, kind of country-sized energy requirements, and so even countries that have a population that might be declining, like Japan, have forecasts of their energy demand going up because of this technology. So I think the first thing is that everybody just needed more energy. The South Asian countries that are still growing their economy, India has 200 million people who still don't have electricity. So countries are just still trying to get the energy they need. All of them now are seeing this with more urgency. I don't think they're all turning back to Russia, but they are looking for options. A lot of them are buying more American oil and gas. They want to get from Canada. Canada has an infrastructure problem, the same problem we've had for the last 10 years. We can't just ramp up and get people more energy because we're kind of really closely balanced between our pipeline capacity and our production. And so, our, prices, and I don't want to name hubs, but they're still well below what the global market is demanding because our producers can't actually access those prices because of infrastructure.
Wow. Okay. So it sounds like Canada has taken some steps. But what have we been able to deliver thus far? We only have about 30 seconds, then we can continue in the next segment.
Canada is committed to exporting an additional 140,000 barrels a day of oil, which is about 2% of what we produce now. This is a drop in the bucket of the 23 million barrels a day that the International Energy Agency is trying to get online. So what I hope is that this is a real galvanizing thing for the government of Canada to work with the provinces and local leaders to get projects built, because otherwise we can't help in the way that we should.
Yes, no, definitely. It's definitely a huge crisis. We're going to pick up this discussion when we come back from this commercial break. Stick around. Are you feeling frustrated with the increased cost of energy? When you go to pump gas, it's costing you a lot more. Well, a lot of that is tied up to the conflicts that are going around the world. We started with Venezuela in the new year, and of course now with Iran and the Strait of Hormuz being choked off, the whole world is feeling that effect. Well, joining me to discuss what Canada can do and what their role is or should be is Shannon Joseph, Chair of Energy for a Secure Future. Again, thank you so much for joining me, Shannon. I really appreciate this discussion, but I have to admit, I get really frustrated because I feel like I've had this discussion multiple times a year for the past 5 years since I've had this show. 10 years ago, when we were talking about things like the Northern Gateway pipeline and all this other energy infrastructure that was demanded 10 years ago, they could be already up and running, and our production of clean energy could displace some of this dirty, corrupt energy that some of the regions of the world produce, or in this case now, lack of energy. I have little hope that something is going to happen. Like, what have we lost in the past 10 years, and why do you remain optimistic?
Well, in the last 10 years, of course, Canada has seen the cancellation of a lot of important projects. Some of them we canceled, like Northern Gateway, and some of them were canceled by other people, like President Biden when he canceled the Keystone XL pipeline, which also would have increased our capacity significantly to export oil from Alberta. So we are in a difficult spot infrastructure-wise. I remain hopeful because I work with people on the ground all over the country who want to have economic opportunities. I was talking to a First Nations leader in New Brunswick who he and neighboring 15 nations are looking at, can we responsibly develop our gas? Of course, on the West Coast, nations in both the upstream, like McLeod Lake Indian Band and Soto, in the downstream, like the Haisla Nation, are owners in pipeline assets and in LNG export assets. And we're really in this space when these projects have been set up in a way that create lasting opportunity for workers, all Canadian workers, for local communities, local First Nations. And now those leaders are really at the forefront of having these projects be successful. And we are waiting, of course, for 2 more final investment decisions on the West Coast for LNG Canada Phase 2, which would double our gas production, and for the Salisbury LNG project, which is about the same size as that first LNG Canada project. And this would significantly increase our capacity to help on the world stage, at least on gas, which is really important for electricity. And those projects are fully permitted. So if we could just get that going and build those projects without delays, we would actually be on time for the expiration of many Russian gas contracts in the region. So countries that were looking to diversify away from those long-term contracts could have the confidence, okay, Canada is actually going to be ready on time. They don't have the infrastructure yet, but we can see the track towards us actually being able to buy Canadian energy. That has not happened before, and we should be laser focused on getting that to happen on the gas side because we're so close on the West Coast. And then seriously think about what can we do on oil, which has a much higher global price, and it is very needed.
I like that you mentioned the First Nations and how they are working hand in glove, I assume with the government, or these companies rather, to bring energy development to the forefront as a path to economic stability and sustainability. And that's great, because a lot of the time we hear this narrative, and I don't know if it's from the government or from the media or both, that these pipelines are going to crush the First Nations. They are very much opposed to it. How much truth is there with some of these projects when we hear there's a big pushback from local Indigenous communities? You say they want this? Well, do they, or is it just it depends on the location?
On the natural gas side, it's been a number of years now that nations have really been at the forefront of these projects. The Haisla played a significant role in getting LNG Canada to its FID. There are 16 First Nations that have equity options on the Coastal GasLink pipeline. Now that it's operating, those nations are taking their options. If you talk to leaders like Karen Ogan, who leads the First Nations Natural Gas Alliance, Crystal, or other leaders, even in the upstream, they'll tell you about the jobs that have come to their communities. People haven't had to leave. They can stay in their communities and make good salaries. Those nations have used that money to increase education spend, to do cultural spend, to recover their language. Things they used to hope the government of Canada would fund, they're doing themselves.
We're talking about many components of what Canada needs and the kind of infrastructure required to get us to the point where we are meeting the needs of the energy of the world. And a lot of these countries are developing nations. Like, shouldn't we have like a moral obligation to help these countries, have basic electricity, like these basic needs? So what kind of infrastructure is going to be required to increase our export capacity? We've mentioned pipelines, we talked about LNG terminals, and how are not having these infrastructure in place already hindering Canada's ability to respond to the need?
Well, not having the infrastructure, whether it's on the gas or the oil side, has significantly hindered our ability to respond. We've only been able to commit to a 2% increase in what we do already because of those infrastructure constraints. So the lucky thing for us is that we actually have permitted projects on the West Coast that we need to hopefully give whatever confidence is needed to those investors who are doing their analysis right now so that they can make their final investment decision and we actually start moving those projects towards construction. But we have to also look at what's going on in the upstream. Like, if you want to fill a pipeline, if you want to, actually increase all these volumes, that means you have to grow production in British Columbia when it comes to gas, in Alberta when it comes to oil. So let's say we could get all those pipelines. We have policies in Canada, like the carbon tax, like the clean electricity regulation, that make it not easy for companies to decide to grow production, even if those kinds of West Coast export projects were to happen. Now, there's an MOU between the federal government and Alberta that is going to have implications, I think, for the country about what happens on that industrial carbon price and what's going to happen with the clean electricity regulations. But, if you want to produce more gas, when it comes out of the ground, you actually have to process the gas because it comes out with gas and liquid. If you have too high of a carbon tax on a facility like that, you hurt the economics of growing that production, in building that facility. And Canada's the only country that produces oil in the world that has this kind of tax. And so we really have to think, are we being consistent? Is our build, baby, build message, for example, from the Prime Minister, consistent with a commitment to raise our carbon tax to $130 a ton? Today it's $90, which is still much more than other jurisdictions. If we want to go to 130, will that allow us to fulfill our commitments? Is that the way to do things? From an investor standpoint, if I can invest in the United States where I know that policy does not exist, I'm probably going to put my money there. And that's what's been happening the last 10 years. Right. Canada has lost hundreds of billions of dollars in investment to our neighbors to the south who have, started at zero LNG export facilities like Canada did in 2015. And now they have 7 of them and they're going to build more. There are more kind of through their approval process. And we have 1, thank goodness. But we really need to get those others online. And then we really need to give the signals that people should invest in us to do more because we're serious about being a global player.
I think it's actually immoral. I'm going to take it a step further. I think it's immoral that we have these resources and handcuff our own economy, handcuff ourselves with these taxes, and refuse to share. And share at a profit, I may add. I think it's immoral both for Canadians who feel the effects of this taxation and for those in the developing world who are desperate for and crying for this energy. And we refuse to share. Okay, I only have time for one more question. Okay, so if Canada were to take this moment seriously, we only have 30 seconds. What is the practical pathway to scaling up production to meet this energy demand for the years and months ahead?
I think Canada needs to make clear that it's not going to make any more changes to things like carbon pricing, that it's going to just suspend this clean electricity regulation, which would make it really expensive to operate the gas processing in a lot of these facilities. They just need to make it clear those are off the table for investors. On the oil side, I think it's more complex because we now need to pick a route and we now need to convince an oil company to do this. So
Okay.
A harder road, but we'll see. I think there's a lot that can be done. And I know Alberta is in dialogue with the federal government to make it happen.
Okay, fingers
And
crossed.
with First Nations and others.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, fingers crossed. Thank you so much, Shannon. It's been great to have you on today. Appreciate it. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.